Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this series of webinars from the CEiRSI UK, or Centre of Excellence on In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation. So this is the series of training webinars that is proudly supported by Innovate UK, the Medical Research Council, or MRC, and with the sponsorship as well of the Medicines and Healthcare Products and Regulatory Agency, or MHRA. This is the first UK centre of its kind, and we pioneered the use of in-silico methods to enhance regulatory science and innovation. And our webinars will dive into the latest advancement, best practices, and applications of in-silico approaches that foster collaboration and knowledge sharing among various stakeholders represented, and also drive progress in healthcare and medical research. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steve Kreuzer, who is going to be moderating this webinar. And over to you, Stephen. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We've got what I hope is a very interesting series of questions and conversations that myself, Philippe, and Jeff will be talking through today, specifically on the topic of technical expertise and presented from the perspective of folks who have a regulatory background. So what we are aiming for here, and consistent with the CEiRSI's general motivation to break down barriers between technical teams and regulatory teams and improve the conversations and improve the production of regulatory grade modeling evidence and support those developments. We're hoping to use this forum and another one next week that'll be from the opposite perspective, to really drill down and demystify and reduce the language barrier between regulatory folks and technical folks. So really excited for you guys to join us today. One thing I do want to mention, we have a series of questions that we'll walk through. We got 5 topics and a number of questions in between or within each one of those topics. So we'll talk through those, and we definitely, though, want to make sure that we incorporate any questions that you guys have in the audience. So please feel free to enter your questions. We may take them as we go through the topics, but more likely we'll return to them at the end. So please make sure that as questions come up, you're logging those into the chat box so that we can see those and we can disposition them when the time comes. So with that out of the way, so my name is Steve Kreuzer. So I'm a senior managing engineer at Exponent, do a lot of modeling work, a lot of work with our regulatory affairs folks within Exponent. And we work with a lot of different companies, both on the device side and the pharmaceutical side. My interest is primarily in the application of these in silico tools to help develop therapies and treatments for all different types of diseases. I'm really excited to be joined today by Philippe and Jeff. Their expertise is robust in this area from a technical perspective, as well as both of these guys have published on the use of modeling and simulation for regulatory purposes. So really some strong expertise present here today. So very excited about that. I'm going to kick it over to Philippe for his intro, and then we'll get it to Jeff, and we'll jump into the questions after that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve, for a nice intro. So my name is Philippe Favre. I work as an associate director at Zimmer Biomet. I've been doing modeling my whole career. So I've started working in an orthopedic hospital, working with the surgeons, answering their questions, and using cadaver testing, bones testing, but also a lot of modeling already then. I did my PhD in modeling of the shoulder, and then in 2011 I moved to Zimmer Biomet, where I've been in the computational modeling group, which I lead since 2017. And here we are a group of 10 engineers running simulations day out, day in for the company.
My name is Jeff Bodner. My title is Distinguished Scientist here at Medtronic, which I think is a misnomer on both parts. I'm actually an engineer by training and certainly not very distinguished, but also a Medtronic Technical Fellow. And I work here at our operational headquarters in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in a small group of simulation engineers that really serve the whole enterprise of Medtronic around the globe, helping the engineers down in the trenches use modeling and simulation and advance the methods and techniques that we have and are used across different operating units. I was also a former member of the ASME V&V 40 Standards Committee, and still remain very engaged with the ASME V&V standards group and community. So model verification and validation has become a topic of great interest for me over the years. And it's a real pleasure being here. Thank you, Steve, for the invitation.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining. On that note, so Jeff mentioned the V&V standard, credibility in general. Both these, and I mentioned as well, both these guys are well published in this space. So I do want to note that in the comment or the description for the YouTube link when it goes up, we'll include some links to the various papers that these guys have put together, as well as some links for the standards that we reference in this discussion, primarily V&V 40, as well as the FDA Credibility Assessment Guide, and probably the reporting guide as well. Those are important references for you from a regulatory perspective to be familiar with, at least, as well as obviously those who are a technical audience to definitely be familiar with there. The other thing I want to point out, this is one of a series of webinars, as Alex mentioned, associated with the CEiRSI. One of the prior webinars, I believe it was on March 4th, or no, it was before that. One of the prior webinars did go into an overview of the credibility frameworks. So that will include a link for as well, so that folks can get some basic understanding if you're not familiar. Many of our questions are not going to be down in the trenches specifically with respect to the frameworks presented in those guidances, the workflows, et cetera. So some of our answers may reference, or you may want to go back and check some of those. We can obviously provide more details if necessary and put those details in the questions if you have them. But you do want to look at those references just to keep an eye on it. But without further ado, let's get into it. So our first topic today that we'll talk about is documentation and evidence requirements. So everybody get real excited there. Now, this is obviously really important. We need to make sure that whatever we're producing from a modeling standpoint is clearly documented in a way that is communicable to the folks who are receiving that information, oftentimes within regulatory agencies. The first question I'm going to go to here is around limitations and assumptions. And so the question for Philippe and Jeff is, how can we effectively communicate model limitations and assumptions to regulators without, and this is going to be a key here, without undermining confidence in the results? So I'm going to start with Jeff, and then we'll just bounce back and forth between the two of you guys in terms of who I ping the question to. But Jeff, how can we communicate these model limitations and assumptions without drawing too much questions on our confidence?
Yeah, it would be an interesting conversation to have. And I would start by reminding others that all of our sources of evidence in some way can be considered models that have limitations and assumptions, whether it be bench testing, animal studies, or even the human clinical trial, the traditional type. And in fact, the FDA, Dr. Tina Morrison of the FDA has spoken to exactly this issue and made this point, that all of these are models of the post-market experience. They are all imperfect, and they all have some assumptions and limitations. So starting there, the simulation doesn't look very different than from what we're used to from that perspective. And I would also mention certainly the guidance documents that we now have in the United States from the FDA, the 2016 guidance on reporting, really does ask the sponsors to be upfront about their limitations and assumptions going in. So I think transparency is really a big part of this as well, that we shouldn't run from these issues and hide from them, but rather, admit them and take them on kind of head on. So that's where I would start the conversation, is just a more general conversation about sources of evidence and the limitations and assumptions behind each of them. And that really modeling and simulation is not really unique in this manner.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jeff. I really like that. Philippe, anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I was going to say really be transparent, as Jeff said. If there are limitations, and like Jeff said, any model has limitations, it's important to really know what they are. And models have limitations. We can't answer everything. There are things we can use them for. There are other things that they are not able to answer. And it's also, we want to make sure that we do the right thing, right? The patient is in the end benefiting or maybe having issues because we make the wrong decisions. So we really want to make sure that any limitations we make, we understand the implications in the decisions in the end. And that helps us, if in the end we see, well, the limitations are such that maybe our conclusions aren't right, then you need to take a different modeling approach. Potentially, you need to add more testing, and you have plenty of other options to make sure that eventually you take the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the places I like to go or to think about with these limitations is assumptions, particularly in the credibility guidance from the FDA, is around the applicability analysis. So there's both the prospective and post-study applicability discussion and adequacy discussion that it calls for. And, it clearly calls out to go through that and think about, based on the evidence that you gathered or plan to gather, how do those limitations and assumptions that you might have in your model apply or not apply, and what are some of the considerations there? So, no, great thoughts there, guys. So I want to move from that point to on the documentation side of things, in particular, thinking about the level of detail and how we think about this, and keeping in mind that many of the folks who are listening to this are on the regulatory side of things, and might not necessarily understand the depth of information that we can produce from a modeling standpoint. The question here is how do we decide the level of detail to include about methodology in our submission? So when we're putting together a modeling report, we're putting together this evidence, what level of detail should we strive for from regulatory perspective, regulatory affairs professionals' perspective? What should they be looking for to ask from their modeling teams? So Philippe, how would you decide on the level of detail to include in submissions when you're putting that together?
So we're lucky enough to have some regulation there, the guidance from the FDA on what to report on computational modeling, which gives us a clear guidance of what should be included in the report. It is already quite detailed. Maybe for some regulatory people that goes too much into detail, I can tell. But that really helps us make sure that we hit all the important points in our model. So that's the guidance side of things. On our side, we also make sure that there's enough detail in the report to make sure that the study is reproducible. Very often we develop a new knee, and 10 years later we look back at what has been done 10 years ago, and we really want to have good documentation to be able to understand exactly what has been done, not have to reinvent the wheel, built on the legacy, basically. So in that sense, I would say it's very academic. You want to make sure the study is reproducible. And also another point maybe is it differs on the countries you talk to. So again, for the USA, you have the FDA guidelines. It's pretty clear when you need to put in. Some other countries will have maybe no guidelines or different approaches where they will ask more detailed questions on very specific aspects that you would not hear from different countries. So I think there is also some variability as well there.
Jeff, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I would just build on that by saying, the FDA's guidance on this, I think if I had to summarize it, would be tell us everything. I think it's very much a request to be completely transparent about all aspects of it. In fact, there was even some discussion along the way about whether or not the FDA could ask sponsors to submit the actual simulation files themselves. That was never adopted, but it just kind of, I think, reinforces the idea that they wanted more than less. I would also make the point that how you present the information is also, I think, important. And I found this out the hard way, where in one experience I had submitted some simulation results presented, I guess, or plotted in a way that made sense to me as a technical expert, consistent with how, say, certain other technical guidelines or documents would have suggested doing it. And it didn't resonate with regulatory with regulators. However, when we went back and replotted or represented the data in a slightly different way, a little less perhaps technically strict, but more approachable, it made a huge difference. So just even thinking about your audience and the fact that a lot of the frontline regulators are generalists and not specialists. You know, thinking about them as your audience is really important in trying to figure out how to present the information.
I like that point a lot. In particular, again, for those folks in the audience who are RA professionals, making sure you ask questions. You know, I think from a modeling perspective, and you know, to emphasize what Jeff was pointing out there, and that on the technical side of things, we tend to get kind of geeky and nerdy about the way we develop data, the way we present it. We're talking to ourselves in a lot of ways when we're communicating those results. And that level of detail is very important to the point that both of these guys made in terms of having that level of documentation available so it can be questioned. And I really like the point so that you can reproduce it down the road if you need to make a comparison. That kind of stuff, very important. However, you know, Jeff's point of bringing things back, making it really approachable is valuable. It's important for the technical folks who are listening to this to understand that, to make sure that the results you're presenting are presented in an approachable way. But for those RA folks out there, if something doesn't make sense to you internally, you're working with your modeling team internally, make sure you ask those questions. There really is no such thing as a dumb question, but particularly when we're talking about these complex things, it may be that we as computational folks, as the technical side of things, are not presenting the information in a way that is going to be approachable to the end user. And so I think that's a very, very strong point. I really like that. Thank you. Along those lines, I think, you know, both of you guys have experience discussing publicly the way in which you are able to think about modeling outputs and translating those into the types of information that demonstrate safety and efficacy. And, you know, I'll put those in quotations, safety and efficacy, because in a lot of ways, you know, we're making predictions, we're producing evidence that is hoping to contribute to the overall picture of safety and efficacy for a device, and that's very important to keep in mind. But I find this question to be particularly valuable when we're working with teams is, how do you take modeling outputs? What are some of the concepts you want to keep in mind as you're considering outputs from modeling software and trying to translate that into the language or the type of evidence that regulators might expect that's not going to be as detailed as, you know, a contour plot of some kind of stress output or something like that? What are some of the concepts that you like to keep in mind there to make sure it gets to approachability, but it also gets to applicability, really, of the detailed technical information in a clinical or regulatory sense? So, Jeff, do you have any thoughts on how you might translate some of that detailed technical information into the types of evidence and the right language for consumption by regulatory folks?
Your question makes me think a lot about the In-Silico clinical trial case, where I think this is really acute, right? Where we have simulations that give us engineering outputs like stresses and strains, temperatures, voltages, velocities, right? But those are not the things of which clinical endpoints are written, right? Clinical endpoints speak to things like mortality, morbidity, pain scores, time to failure. I mean, those are the things that are clinically observable and clinically measurable. And so there is a big gap sometimes between those two worlds. And in fact, I think that's actually one of the biggest barriers we have for realizing that kind of ultimate use of simulation to speak to these you know, in-silico clinical trials and these clinical questions, is that we often are missing the data to make the linkage between the engineering output and the clinical output. And in some cases we have it. There are, I think, a limited number of cases where you can say that, yeah, we have that transfer function or that linkage understood. But in many cases, that understanding that requires clinical data. And it's not often that you get to run a clinical study to support building or validating a model. So there creates a situation there where we're often faced with a lack of information or a lack of understanding of how to make that relationship.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Philippe, you've specifically published on patient harms and ways to consider those. Do you have anything to add there in terms of translating complex model outputs into these sort of patient-specific, or not patient-specific, but clinically relevant considerations and outputs?
So we did publish on the patient harms, but it was about selecting those that, you know, you should include in in-silico clinical trials. It was not about making the link between the modeling output to the clinical endpoint. And that is, I think Jeff really put it very well. It's in some cases, it's really clear, implant fracture, hip stem breaking that's related to stress in the stem. That's established. Nobody will question that. But there are others like loosening of an implant related to, typically people would look at micromotion, so motion between the implant and the bone. Some people would look at strain at the interface. So different outputs used by different people, different academic groups, and there is no clear, even within the community, no clear, how should I say? No one agrees really yet. And there are some things I'm not sure we'll ever find out, like pain. How do you model pain? There are so many things. There's a lot of patient psychology as well. So it's I think some things still remain to be done, and some I think they are out of scope.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. And I like the concept of being out of scope, and we should keep in mind that, and I think this is comfortable for a lot of technical folks, but we should keep in mind that in a lot of ways, we can predict certain things, to your point, fracture of implants, things of that nature. We have the sort of materials expertise to be able to interpret that. But in many ways, when you start zooming out, you start thinking about system level biological responses, it becomes much more challenging, and there is a requirement for more evidence to make that link between what our specific, maybe acute modeling outputs might be and some of the more longer term clinical outputs. The response of the body is something that is difficult to model in many ways, even if we can capture the sort of post-procedural state in a decent frame.
And really, it goes back to model limitations, as we said.
Yeah,
it's again, what can you do with the model, and what can you not do?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Fantastic. So I think what we should do now is kind of get into, and we touched on this a little bit with respect to our next topic of clinical relevance, risk management, things of that nature. The question I want to go to here is one that on the topic of failure modes in particular. And this relates to how we might be able to use models to predict potential failure modes, particularly those that are prevalent or possible, at least, that might not show up in more traditional standardized testing. So this might be a scenario where there's a very well-established benchtop test for a particular loading mode of a device, for instance. And maybe that particular device has historically been tested against this. Are there any ways that modeling and simulation can help us to predict additional failure modes or things that might go beyond the scope of traditional testing? So, Philippe, I'll go to you. How can models help us predict potential failure modes that might not be captured in traditional testing?
So there are, technical limitations to physical testing as well. So typically, if you look at, stress you want to look at the stress in an implant, it's really difficult to look at that in a physical test. You would put sensors in very specific locations, but you won't get the full stress pattern. So this is something where validation or modeling is actually great at. And there are other things that I personally don't know how you would do that in a physical testing. For example, patient-specific models. If you, Stephen, you need an implant for the shoulder, and we want to make sure that this implant will fit you and not somebody else, that your range of motion will be good, that you will have good clinical outcomes. I think this would be really challenging in a physical testing. And what a physical testing engineer would do typically is explant your bones, test it on the machine, but then it's too late to put it back in. Whereas with a model, you can do that operatively. So I think there is a lot of value to modeling and a lot of applications. What we've also seen is, interestingly, maybe not where failure modes are not explained, but we've seen physical testing where the results didn't make sense really, from common engineering sense. And using the simulations, testing hypothesis, we were able to answer or understand why the physical test was giving that kind of results, and we're able to maybe fix or orient the physical test in a different direction. So that's also another aspect.
I like that. I like that a lot, the interpretation aspect of the physical tests and using the model to help interpret that, and really taking this perspective, again, as has been discussed before, of, these types of, these categories of evidence should really be considered in parallel to each other. It's, not that one feeds the other, it's that they're sort of both coexisting together with the other sources of evidence, animal studies and clinical studies, so like that. Jeff, anything to add on that question in terms of potential failure modes that might not be captured in traditional testing?
Yeah, it made me think about the quote that I'll attribute it to Dr. Bill Oberkampf, and I don't know if he's the originator or just someone who repeats it frequently, but he says that testing is full reality partially revealed, and simulation is partial reality fully revealed. In other words, the simulation only contains some of the reality, right? It only includes the failure modes we imagine putting in it. So in some sense, this is a limitation of simulation, is that if we don't imagine something failing and we don't include that physics in the model, the simulation is useless for understanding that failure mode, right? So it only includes the things we imagine and put in the math. However, what it does allow us to do is to look everywhere in the system. We have everything is fully revealed to us in terms of the outputs, where a test may only have specific sensors in certain locations. They give us just some of what's going on in the system, but the simulation is fully transparent to us, and we can see everything that's happening everywhere at once. And so they're complementary in some sense. But ultimately, again, if you can't imagine a failure mode or don't think to include it, the simulation is not going to provide it to you. It's really a reflection of what you understand about the failures.
Yeah, that is awesome. And you referred to Oberkampf and Roy, who those in the technical community are probably very familiar with those. If you're not, you should become familiar with those names, the references and links. I got the book on the shelf right back there. We'll include a link in the YouTube comments or what have you, description for some of their work. But that's really important underframing, underpinning of much of the credibility work, the uncertainty quantification type stuff. So I really like that reference. All right, fantastic, guys. Let's think about a question that relates to sufficiency of the evidence. And Jeff, I'm going to go to you here. We'll sort of snake through. How do you determine when the results you have from simulation are sufficient versus when you might want to gather additional preclinical testing evidence? I think this is part of the frameworks, and there's discussion of applicability, robustness of the evidence that you have. But as you walk through this process of running some models, what are some of the first indications that you have that maybe you need to get some more evidence, some preclinical testing data or clinical testing? And how do you determine internally, perhaps before, obviously, you send something out to an agency and they come back and say it's not sufficient? How do you think about determining when results are sufficient versus requiring more credibility evidence?
And is this in the context of simulation generally, or in the context of an in-silico clinical trial? Are we
simulation generally? So let's think about support for preclinical testing or in-silico clinical trials, either one.
Okay. Yeah, this is really subjective. Hopefully you have the discussions with your stakeholders as you're developing your credibility plan, right? So hopefully up front, okay, we have a model, we want to use it for this purpose. We have the FDA guidance and VNV40 as ways to help us plan what activities we want to do and the level of rigor we want to bring to each of these different elements of verification and validation. And hopefully that involves a discussion on adequacy and what level of data we're going to collect and whether or not that will be good enough. And the FDA guidance even suggests a pre-sub conversation with them at some point to make sure that they're on board with the plan before you begin taking these steps, because they can be expensive in terms of effort and time. So hopefully all those questions are already imagined and answered in the planning phase. That's the best answer to the question, is not to wait until after you gather the data and then start asking, is this good enough? But rather just to pre-plan for what information is necessary. Now that's an ideal world, and often there's going to need to be a feedback loop there. But I think the best plan is to plan as carefully as possible up front.
Yeah, I like that. Jeff, on that topic of the pre-sub meetings, and just to piggyback off of that real quick before we jump over to Philippe on this question, on the pre-sub meetings, for those who in the audience who may not have gone through one of those from a modeling context, what type of information or questions are you generally bringing to the FDA in that case, or any regulatory agency in those initial conversations?
Yeah, so the process starts with a risk assessment, where we're trying to understand the consequences should the simulation accuracy not be what we're hoping it would be. So what is the eventual or possible harm that could come to a patient should the simulation lead us astray? So there's a conversation that's focused on that risk assessment, and did we grade the risk appropriately? Are we being either too kind to ourselves or too hard on ourselves, or did we get that balance right? And that risk assessment really then drives the conversation on the amount of verification and validation. So the guidance document, is really not prescriptive in telling you what to do, other than to summarize the verification validation activities in a sort of structured way to allow that subjective conversation to happen with stakeholders, including the regulators, on what might be good enough. And there's no precise or mathematical answer to that question. It is a conversation, but the guidance documents provide you just a structured way of having that conversation with them.
Like it. Very nice. Thank you, Jeff. Philippe, on that question, and related specifically to these conversations around sufficiency of evidence and conversations in the earlier stages with regulatory agencies, do you have any thoughts on communicating the plan and discussing some of these sufficiency issues with regulatory agencies, particularly those that may be in Europe or the UK?
Yes, so specifically I think, for the typical use, such as worst case identification and those kind of things, like the classic use that's widely accepted, there is no need to really discuss. And as Jeff said, the validation tells you what you need to get, but sometimes, you don't get exactly the result you were hoping for. And if the validation shows you that the model isn't right, then you might need extra testing to refine your model even further. In the sense of novel applications, where you would go to a Q-sub meeting or a discussion directly with the regulatory bodies in Europe, yeah, that's a big part of the discussion. When is the model enough? And again, those discussions are great because you can make sure that you're aligned with those people who will then review your documentation. One thing I would like to highlight a big difference though between the USA and Europe. In the US, the FDA in the Q-sub meeting, you will have a very open discussion about the model, about the approach. They might even tell you to do things differently. Whereas in Europe, the regulatory bodies are not allowed to give advice. So they will only say if they agree with your approach, which requires a bit of a different approach to the meeting, trying to get the information you want in a different way, but that's also very helpful just to make sure you're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, that's interesting. I appreciate that perspective, and definitely something that the folks online are going to want to pay attention to in terms of how you can get some of that information up front. To piggyback off of that, Philippe, what kind of approaches can you take for those early conversations to try to get the right information? Are there any sort of hints or tips that might be valuable for how to address or structure conversations that would be useful for teams to know prior to going into that?
Yes, so I think, the regulatory bodies won't tell you what to do. So really go there with questions like, do you agree with if we take that approach? Expose your approach, you agree with it, this I think is acceptable, you will get an answer. But don't have open questions like, do you think we should rather go that route or that route? Or and this you won't get an answer. But be transparent, really expose your plan, and yeah, and see if that works. And if they say, well, no, that doesn't work, then it's on you to come back with a different approach.
Got it.
Solution to fix it.
That makes sense. Appreciate you shedding some light on that. I'm going to touch a little bit before we get into the next topic, but I do think this is going to lead into the next topic, which is patient variability. While we're still on the question of clinical relevance, and this is going to be a question for Jeff first. When we're thinking about in silico clinical trials, which for the audience, this is this concept that we might be able to run, and that we can run really, clinical trials computationally that might produce evidence that either helps to design a trial or is assessed in parallel with human clinical trials. But when we're thinking about in silico trials, how would you think about this concept that you're going to, in the course of running these trials, these computational trials, you're going to have a degree of patient variability. You're going to have a number of different patients who you are simulating. So virtual patients, synthetic patients, whatever you want to call them. You're going to be simulating this virtual cohort. You're going to get a distribution of whatever your outputs are. Now, in some circumstances, ideally, that distribution of performance might line up with expectations or clinical data or what have you. But how do we think about assessment of in silico clinical trial results when you have a distribution of results that might show different data than a clinical set of data? How might we think about the discrepancies between these from a risk perspective, really from regulatory side of things?
Yeah. Ideally, the in silico clinical trial framework or plan should be designed with this idea in mind. So, for example, back in around 2014-15, there was a framework published through a group from the Medical Device Innovation Consortium that did a mock submission with the FDA, and they proposed a Bayesian framework for doing these trials where you would have some real patients and some virtual patients, and there was a weight that was assigned to the simulation results, and that varied depending on how closely it matched with the real patient data. So should there be a large discrepancy, the simulation data was discounted. And the real human patient data then took on more weight. So that was how they dealt. So that was one idea on how they dealt with it. I published a paper with a colleague here a few years ago. We had a different idea, which was where the clinical trial would happen in two cohorts. A first cohort, which was designed to validate the model. So there was real human patients, and then a comparison to the model. And should the comparison look good, then the second cohort could be virtual because you've demonstrated the validity of the model already. However, if it wasn't, then the model in a sense is abandoned, and the second cohort is real patients, in a sense, ending up with what would have been the traditional trial design that you would have run, pre-simulation, if you like, or without the simulation at all. So it was trying to address the risk that the business might perceive in trying to use a model in this way. So there are different ideas on how to do this. I don't think there's any one that's bubbled to the top yet. I don't think we have enough experience to choose one of over the other, but I think over time there will probably be various techniques for trying to address this problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, love that. Love that. Philippe, any thoughts on that in terms of discrepancies between the two?
I would just add that it really depends on the COU of the context of use of your study. If what you want to do with your in silico clinical trial is to be really precise in predicting the failure, in terms of percentage of the population or something like this. If this is your context of use, then your data better be precise in that sense. If your in silico clinical trial wants to compare a predicate device to another one, then you might not need to be really precise in terms of absolute values, but in terms of ranking. You want to be able to show that your modeling approach can differentiate between a good device and maybe a less good device. And that is then sufficient. You don't need to be extremely precise in the values, maybe.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that. Both frameworks are really good. We'll include the link to the paper that both the MDIC study as well as the paper that Jeff was referring to in the notes section on YouTube when we get there. But continuing on the discussion of variability and really as it relates to either in silico clinical trials or just assessments for purposes of preclinical generation of evidence, when we're thinking about patient-to-patient variability and trying to understand this patient variability and incorporate that really in our models, and this is maybe sort of zooming out a little bit, but how do we account for that? How do we incorporate the fact that patients are going to have different characteristics, they're going to perform differently? When we want to perform our models and we want to put it into a context that can be leveraged by regulatory professionals, what are some ways in which our models do account for this variability when simulating implantable device performance and best practices, things of that nature? So Philippe, I'll go to you first on this one.
So in the world of orthopedics, we get the variability from the patients, most of it from the CT scan. Typically, that's the kind of medical imaging that we use as input. We can use that imaging to create a 3D model of the bone from that patient, that very specific patient. From this, we can get the shape. We can get the cortical thickness. We can get the bone density as well. So a lot of really good information we get from that model, from that image. Another thing that is very variable between patients is the type of activities or the activity levels. And this, I would say, is a bit more tricky. We don't have so much information. There is a good study from a group in Germany, or they've published actually quite a lot with patients that were implanted with prostheses that had force sensors. So they measure basically, when a patient does whatever activity, you get exactly the force that is applied to the implant at that time. So great value, but it's limited number of patients. It's a very specific implant. So here we do what we can. There are a lot of models as well, musculoskeletal models that can provide information. That's, I would say, the best practice. One key source of variability also I would like to highlight, of course, it's the patient, but the surgeon also is a huge variability. So every surgeon will, implant differently, choose for a given patient a different implant. They will. So that is also something that we can actually incorporate in the models based on published studies. What is the typical angles that surgeons would place an implant at, and those kind of things.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Both points are really, well, the last 2 points in particular. One, in terms of activity levels. So, there's the procedural aspect of things, which is really important. But there's also then what downstream use is going to happen and how that impacts whatever the performance of the device is. It's a very good reminder there. And procedurally, in terms of physician variability, that's a key component to many of these approaches. Absolutely love those. Jeff, I want to go to you next. I know Medtronic has quite a few devices that are outside the orthopedic space. I don't actually know if you have any that are. You do have some, but particularly in a cardio sense, where you're thinking about a TAVR or some other kind of device that's going to be implanted in the valve space or so forth. In those circumstances, there are some relatively advanced imaging approaches that give you a good sense for anatomy. There's some scenarios where you don't have as much information as you might want from a geometry standpoint. But I think one of the key aspects that always comes up in terms of patient-to-patient variability in the cardio space is really how you start to incorporate things like material properties and other things you can't really clinically measure super well. So what are some best practices in those scenarios where the clinical information you can gather is just necessarily limited by the methods available for gathering that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so broadly speaking, I think Philip hit it right on the head. Broadly speaking, we can think about, variation in geometry, and we can think about variation in, say, material properties, and then sort of the third broad category is then all the loading or the boundary conditions if we're being mathematical about it. And so to your point, imaging can help us get the geometry and the variation there. Though I will say, though, that one limitation we have is, just because a company has clinical data, say historical clinical data, doesn't mean the engineers make it easy for engineers to mine the data. In other words, HIPAA regulations and things like that often put a lot of roadblocks in between the practicing engineer and that historical data that could be used to extract the sort of information we're talking about. So we've found that in principle this works, but in practice is actually challenging often to get that information even from within the company. But then when it comes to some of the material properties, we're on much shakier ground. The literature obviously does have information on things like the properties of endocardium. But if you do a literature survey, you'll find really poor reproducibility across studies and very small sample sizes within the studies, which makes it very hard to try to construct some sort of probabilistic understanding of a population of human patients. This is a big gap that we've got. And, there are good reasons for it. This testing is really hard to do. There isn't a great reward, I think, for academic researchers for just gathering this sort of data and publishing it. And every little subtlety on how you perform those tests matters in big ways, so that this gets to the sort of the lack of reproducibility across studies. So a lot of times we're forced to acknowledge what we would call our epistemic uncertainty, which is our lack of knowledge. In other words, we can talk about known distributions, and that would be ideal if we can get to it, but oftentimes we're left with unknowns. There are ways of dealing with that mathematically. There are techniques for treating that, but things get complicated and expensive very quickly this way, and it just makes the story harder to tell. So this is a problem that we've got, I guess across all simulation types when it comes to medical device simulation, where we're trying to understand the interface between a device and a human patient.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the concept of epistemic uncertainty. It's another one that in the technical community we should be thinking a lot about and acknowledging, to your point. There's just some things that we're just not going to know, and there are methods for dealing with that. And so from a regulatory perspective, it's important that you're trying to dig down into what those things are. You're probing your modeling teams to try to make sure that they're incorporating at least the acknowledgement of that and how to handle that and dealing with all of those things. Just to project forward a little bit on that. So Jeff, if you were to construct clinical studies to try to gather some of that data, what type of information would be valuable to collect from a clinical study that, and acknowledging this is going to be very specific to the device, obviously, but what are some of the considerations that you might want to write into a trial if you're able to gather data to support future modeling efforts?
Yeah, that is going to be so problem specific. But I think, broadly speaking, I think we can think about imaging is going to be always useful and important. And then there could be any number of other clinical measurements or diagnostics that could be useful for model construction or validation. But I think the real question then kind of comes down to, from a ethics perspective, cost perspective, will both the sponsor and the hospitals, performing the clinical trials, are they going to be open to collecting information that's not directly needed for the execution of the trial, but is used to build or validate this model? And so this is, I think, a new issue that we haven't probably had to think about before at scale. But so, for example, it might be very useful to do one more CT scan than would be the normal clinical practice in order to get information to validate a model. But that CT scan comes with a cost and a danger to the patient by exposing them to additional radiation. And I don't think we've quite begun to understand how to weigh the value proposition of that, and whether or not that makes sense, for that patient and for the patient community. Is there enough benefit to justify that additional scan? And that's just one example. I mean, a scan is one idea, but there could be other diagnostics that could induce pain or discomfort. A blood draw, is still a needle. So it's routine, but yet it is an intervention. And so, if we did these things just for the purposes of informing our simulation, I think that's a new question. And I don't know that we've really got a great way to talk about that yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. Great question. Yeah, it's a good consideration. Philippe, anything to add on to that one in particular?
Yeah, maybe on the patient's data. Yeah, so definitely imaging for us is great. And we do ask the surgeon to do an extra CT scan sometimes for studies, for model validation. But that comes, as Jeff said, at a cost. And very often we need ethics committee approval, which is a good way to make sure, that, we don't ask this for not the right reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another point that I would like to highlight also is, patient data is key, and with more patient-specific modeling, that's what we actually need. And it's exactly the time now where it's getting more and more difficult to get, actually.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of patient or legal restrictions on getting access to patient data, and that is, I mean, in my mind, really something that is preventing us from innovation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that echoes what Jeff had said earlier too, as well, in terms of, just because Medtronic or Zimmer might have the information somewhere within the large organizations you guys represent, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have access to it from a modeling perspective. So considering that, and from a regulatory perspective, making sure that you're working through those challenges. And if you see the benefit of the modeling, trying to grease the wheels to whatever extent you can in terms of information sharing, ethically, of course, but just trying to make sure that you're getting as much information as possible between the different groups, I think is obviously very important there. Jeff, this brings up, perhaps on the topic as well of gathering information, but also on the topic of maybe not ethics, but just as thinking about post-market surveillance and thinking about potential concerns that might arise from the use of a given device. So obviously, we work as hard as we can to avoid any kind of failures, but inevitably there are questions that arise in a post-market environment. And some of those may be addressed with respect to looking at patient variability. Some of them might be from gathering real-world evidence. But Jeff, do you have any thoughts on how modeling can help us to address post-market surveillance questions from regulators?
I'm not aware of a lot of experiences with this particular topic. I think it's an interesting proposal. What comes to mind might be the idea that post-market data could act as another post hoc validation of the model. And should we see a growing discrepancy or divergence between what we've simulated and what, which kind of in some sense represents what we expected was going to happen, the best of our knowledge, hopefully at the end of the product development process, and then this post-market launch surveillance, if these two data sets start to diverge, that could be some sign of trouble to come. It could just be a sign that the patient population is broader than what we anticipated when we built the model. So there's a number of different possibilities with what that divergence could represent. I suppose in the ultimate idea of this might be that it becomes or evolves into, this term has got a lot of weight and does a lot of heavy lifting, but the digital twin idea, where there is now a two-way exchange of information now from the post-market surveillance back to the model, and then the model then updating to tell us what's going to happen next in the patient population, and around we can go to try to maintain a connection to that post-market experience and make sure we understand what's really happening as the product evolves in the market.
I like that. Philippe, anything to add on to that? I think you guys see some interesting stuff on the ortho side of things.
Yeah, so I've heard of an old example where, both the physical, well, actually the physical testing was applying some loads on a knee component, seeing some fracture. The device was released, was reproducing fractures on the physical test. The product was released, and there were some fractures on the field, but not in the same location. And so that helped actually redesign the test and then get a test that would reproduce those failures exactly. And then that helps eventually, and I think it went into a standard eventually. So that's absolutely great data. In general, modeling is also actually a great tool. When you see too many failures in the field and you want to know what the root cause is, modeling can be great, because that's where you can do all your sensitivity analysis. Having poor bone support, having different loads, having different tolerances even, and that has helped us in a few cases. Yes.
Nice, very nice. Philippe, I'll stay with you here. On the question of synthetic patients, and thinking about how we can ensure that they adequately represent the diversity of our intended patient population, can you just give sort of a consideration for how you might go about creating a set of synthetic patients that might not be specifically based on scans? So if you wanted to create sort of artificial, or again, using this concept of synthetic patients, how can you ensure that the collection of properties that you give to a virtual patient are going to be realistic with respect to the ultimate performance? If the only information you have are sort of distributions of individual components and things, how do you what sort of steps do we have as a modeling community to ensure that we have adequate representation of the diversity of a patient population?
So personally, I don't have experience with that approach. The In-Silico clinical trials that we've run were on true CT scans.
Okay.
But I think it's a great tool, because you're limited in number of scans. So if you want to have really huge statistical power, it's great to generate synthetic data. There's a lot of literature on for bones. Typically, what is the typical variability, or the typical ranges of size with different shapes of bones that you would see. So that's something we do typically, to make sure that our population, even though it's based on CT scans, we want to make sure that the bones we took are representative of the whole population. So that is something we do. We compare it to published literature. Another thing we do also is, as a manufacturer, we have access to sales data. And so we can see what size of the different components are sold most. And that gives us also, a bell curve that is probably correlated to what is, the occurrence of those sizes in the population. So that's also a data set that we compare against.
Yeah, that's useful. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of representing diversity, particularly when you have wide range of characteristics for patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think it highlights a bit of a catch-22 where we want to, use simulation to reduce our dependence on real patient data, but we need real patient data to build the simulation. And so, it's a little bit, almost seems so self-defeating in the sense that, you need to gather that clinical data to build the model. I think one of the advantages of a simulation is that since we have full control over the inputs, we can really make them anything we want. And so, it makes me think about, there are times where a simulation can be very useful for looking at subpopulations of patients that we may not see in the clinical data. So for example, children, there's certain other groups that for some reason just aren't well represented in clinical trials because of either exclusionary criteria or just the people, just cultural issues that some people just don't sign up for trials, or because the fact that a lot of clinical institutions are located in large cities that have a certain population around them. So there's all sorts of issues that I think the FDA has become more keenly tuned in on trial diversity and making sure that the clinical trials are representative of the broad patient population. And so the model can be a real benefit in this regard because we have the potential to, in some sense, very easily extend these distributions to capture other patient groups if we can only figure out how to justify how far to extend them, right? So in
Yeah.
some sense, it can be just an estimate. I mean, in some sense, if you can show good performance with almost absurd levels of variation, then you've answered the question, even if it's not necessarily representative of an accurate representation of any patient population. So
Yeah.
there may be times where just being very conservative is enough, because if your design has that much safety factor, then we don't need to be precise about the patient population. We only need to show that we can handle, a huge variety of
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the challenging part, and I won't put you on the spot on this one, of course, but challenging part becomes when you look at those extremes and you start to see some device performance that is sort of on the edge of acceptability, and now you have to make arguments in terms of just how conservative those extremes may be to a realistic population and what are the expectations there. But I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. I think at this point, let's move on to our next topic, really around evolving capabilities or technologies, sort of in newer methods. I think the group here, the three of us in particular, very experienced with respect to traditional physics-based modeling. Obviously, that's not and so by that we mean finite element analysis, computational fluids, those sorts of things. Methods that have been around for a while. Of course, what I'm hinting at here, getting to, is the emergence of more data-based methods. So machine learning, artificial intelligence type technologies, and just sort of thinking forward in terms of how we start to incorporate those things. In many ways, we've seen machine learning and artificial intelligence be used as a sort of an adjunct to the more traditional physics-based modeling, where they are post-processing tools or they're tools that help you to understand distributions of patients on the input side of things. But increasingly, we are seeing more direct incorporation of some of these methods in either the interpretation of patient data or the analysis that's being performed, or directly in terms of the creation of synthetic patients. As we start to, whether it's machine learning or not, but as we start to change our simulation approaches and as obviously capabilities advance, Philippe, I'll go to you first here. How should, from a regulatory perspective, how should strategy differ when using newer approaches versus using more established ones? What are some of the methods that we have in our community to be able to establish that new methods are reliable or credible, or to ask those fundamental questions?
Yeah, I would say I have two that come to mind. So first is the one we discussed before. So pre-sub, reaching out early to the regulators, making sure that those new technologies will actually be acceptable. You don't want to invest time and money for years on a new technology just to hear at the end that it's not okay. Yeah, and the second one, I think I lost it.
All right. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. We'll go over to Jeff, and if it comes to mind, let us know, Philippe. But so Jeff, on this question of, as you start to have new approaches and incorporate new evidence, what sort of strategies do you have? And maybe I'll tee it up or see, both of you guys have published, as I mentioned, extensively with respect to methods. Is that an approach that one could use to try to at least build industry acceptance, if not direct regulatory support for certain methods? Or what can we start to do, or what can we do to lay the groundwork for bringing in newer technologies?
Yeah, this is a tough one. Because the data-driven world has its own evolving traditions and methods around things like validation that are sort of conceptually, I guess, compatible with how we think about, the physics-based models. But there are obviously important differences there as well. I think it's very early, and I don't know that I have a great answer for how that's going to evolve. There is a new subcommittee in the ASME V&V community that's trying to, to look at this problem and the question of validation of AI models that are being used for making, predictions about physical systems, right? Obviously, we're not so concerned here with AI for, identifying cats in a photo. We're talking about making predictions about, physical systems, right? So that's a different thing than say an email filter or something like that. So it's early, and I think we have to let those groups do some work and figure out what common approaches we can use and what's going to be new and unique. I don't know if I have a great answer other than to say it's an emerging space.
Yeah, no, I like that answer a lot. And I like what you just said in terms of allow those groups to do some work to sort of establish these things. I think it's important to recognize that in many respects, even within a single organization, whoever you happen to have on a modeling team or a group that's responsible for that work, we really are collectively relying on the rest of the community essentially to establish many of the answers to these things. And it's an important point, I think, for the regulatory folks to keep in mind in terms of, the teams that you're working with, whether they're within your company or you're working, as a consultant for other groups or whatever. That's one piece of the puzzle. But collectively, from a technical side of things, we're all really working towards establishing methods and doing the work to ground credibility in what we're doing. So it's important to obviously listen to the groups that you're working with, but also, keep an eye out for other sources of hopefully confirmation with respect to whatever they're saying, your internal groups. So just being aware of what's out there, asking questions, participating in things like this, I think are great for broadening horizons. And then for the technical folks on the conversation here in the meeting, I think it's useful for everybody to realize that there is fundamental work being done, not specific to your companies, which is obviously also very important, but also out there in standards committees, out there in different groups where we're tackling a lot of these large issues and we're trying to come to agreement, at least as an industry, on what these things mean and how to address them. So just a little plug for getting involved as much as possible in these activities to help shape really what things are coming. On that point, or the thought of helping to shape sort of the evolution of capabilities, and maybe this is a point where this is relevant for the regulatory folks, but just sort of more generally as we start to look at emerging technologies. And I'll start with Jeff first. Obviously, there's specific aspects of machine learning that are coming on, and there's large language models, and there's some things that are more well established, or maybe not well established, but common. Are there particular technology areas that you see in the next 3-5 years coming that we should be aware of or should be thinking about in terms of planning or strategizing for maybe not what's in this year's plans, but in future years' plans?
We're keeping a close eye on the literature in the evolving space of hybrid methods, things like physics-informed neural networks. There are a number of different techniques that we can call or have been called scientific machine learning. So they are machine learning methods applied to predicting, physical systems. It's a space that's evolving so fast. I think, there are almost new dissertations and papers being released on, a weekly basis on this, and everybody's trying to figure out the best methods, and it's still very much an academic problem that's being solved, but it's evolving so quickly. I think those methods will become more common and more available to us in the near future. That's just one example of a space we're keeping an eye on, but I think it still feels like it's still a little early yet for implementation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I would agree with that. It's very interesting. It's one of those topics that all the pieces are there in terms of, it sounds like this should be something that helps us, but just really making sure that it's properly bounded and that we're using it in the right ways is going to be really important. Philippe, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of emerging technologies or things to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think obviously AI is big. as far as modeling for us, for our team, we're pretty cautious with AI, because that as soon as we have models and AI on top of it, that's an additional regulatory barrier for which we have very little experience. So we're a bit conservative there. I think there's a lot of potential. AI is a black box. The models can provide an answer to what the black box is telling us. So I think there is a lot of value, a lot of beauty to putting those two together. Another one thing that we're looking at definitely is in terms of in-silico clinical trial, where you generate thousands of models and each of them takes an hour to run. That's a lot of computational power. Even though those models and the computational power is always better, it takes time to run and analyze. So an approach we're taking now is called surrogate modeling, which uses AI, for example, to give it the medical image, and it tells you what the results of a model would look like. And so that is actually, I think, a nice way to use AI, because the risk is not too high. We can still compare to the models. We have a lot of data to train the model, and it's a lot faster. So it's in terms of, again, applicability or applications for us, it's very nice. You can run more in-silico clinical trials, but you can also start thinking about preoperative planning, because then it's a lot faster.
Yeah, it's fast, right? And so that concept of surrogate models, sometimes, at least for those who are not familiar, is this idea that you might run a series of physics-based models in order to generate a data set that you can then train and then use as input after you have a trained model. That's essentially your surrogate model. And then you can use additional input data, imaging data, or what have you, but run it through basically what's a physics-based trained model, the surrogate model, in order to spit out a result, which can be very fast, and I like that. The other point that I'll emphasize that sort of both of you guys hit on is the concept of when we're thinking about machine learning and AI tools and things, in many circumstances, and I think, Philippe, you used the term black box, and that is certainly an impression that many folks have in terms of the models, and I would agree with it in terms of, there's a lot going on under the hood. Exactly, how decisions are made and predictions are made is a little bit uncertain. I do think for those in the regulatory space, one of the advantages, and this is me on my soapbox, but one of the advantages, I think, of physics-based modeling is that we understand the equations that are underneath the hood. You understand what's being put in from an input perspective. And so, leveraging physics-based models is very valuable, but also keeping in your head, for those who are not regular practitioners, keeping in your mind the distinction between a physics-based model where you might understand a little bit more versus a database model that's very good for some applications, but you might not necessarily understand what's going on. Is an important distinction to have. And so when we as a community talk about modeling and simulation, I think in many ways, and maybe this is just me having a chip on my shoulder a little bit here, but in many ways, I feel like AI gets all this attention, and a lot of people pay attention to machine learning approaches, and everybody loves ChatGPT and Claude and all those things. But really the value that physics-based modeling brings because of the explainability, is not to be undersold. So I really think that's important.
Maybe if I can ask something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, one thing we see is in AI, you need tons of data to train a good model, and sometimes getting to that number of that magic threshold of amount of data to get a good predictive model is just too much. Whereas with a physics-based model, you can start with way lower numbers. Again, I think there is a lot of value of bringing those two together.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I like that a lot. And so, RA folks, just keep that in mind. Don't discount the more expensive and complicated sometimes physics-based stuff, but not necessarily in all circumstances. I do want to. I'm going to shift over to Jeff here, and I'm going to ask a question in terms of resources and thinking about learning on these methods. So Jeff, if you were advising somebody who's involved in regulatory affairs about where to begin learning about modeling and simulation, what resources might you recommend to help them, get the essentials? They're not going to go and start, running Abacus or ANSYS or something, but what might be some approachable resources that they can leverage to sort of bring some understanding to their experience and their professional levels?
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know that there are tons of resources that are focused on the sort of the non-expert or the, maybe the class of people who are non-technical or in management that I'm aware of. I do believe there is a document that's published through NAFEMS that may be, in fact, Bill Oberkampf, we mentioned his name earlier, may be the author or co-author on that. That is a document that is really focused on the non-technical decision maker and how to use simulation to make decisions, right? So I think there are a few documents out there that I'm aware of, but not many that are really focused on the non-technical expert. So I think there's a need there, and even to that end, even within the engineering community, a lot of the topics we've talked about today are not covered in their normal educational experiences. There are plenty of obviously there are, at every university, there are classes on how to do modeling, but when you start getting into questions of things like verification and validation and things like that, that's notably absent from the curriculum, which is another thing that the ASME community has talked about trying to address by engaging with the accreditation bodies here, at least in the United States, to try to make sure that the universities aren't ignoring these important issues.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we're going to come back to a question very much like that. But that comment in particular with respect to education is very much, I know, a key focus of Alex and the CEiRSI's focus on, understanding what capabilities. We'll come back to that. But Philippe, I want to give you an opportunity, if you have anything to add on this question, for current regulatory affairs professionals, if they wanted to learn more about modeling and simulation, what types of approaches or resources, rather, might they go to?
I would start with review papers. I know there are, review papers about, at least in orthopedics, all joints. So specifically, what models are current in the shoulder space, in the knee space, in the hip joint. And those are, high level, the site, the reference, the key papers, and that's where I would start. I wouldn't go to very technical niche articles, but rather the overview things first.
Yeah, I like that. And then we'll continue the snake, and I'll ask Philippe this question. So Jeff, you mentioned particularly education in the context of verification validation. And I totally agree with you there. I do not think that's an area that's covered in nearly the depth that it should be with respect to, real hardcore application of these things. But I think more generally, sort of zooming out a little bit, and again, for Philippe, what, from an educational standpoint, for if any graduate students are listening to this or folks who are still early in their career, what topics might you recommend? Particularly, let's think about for people who are on the technical side of things, if they wanted to try to learn more about sort of, the regulatory space or education that might put them in a good position to enter the companies that you guys represent and be able to contribute, not just in running the, turning the gears of a model, but really thinking from a regulatory perspective. Is there anything that you're aware of that they could be thinking about or doing?
That's a good question. It's been a long time since I've been in university. So back then it was very technical, very little regulatory aspects. I know of some universities that include that in their curriculum, VNV and those kind of things, but I don't know many. I don't have a better answer.
No, that's fine. And I think that probably speaks to the lack of that type of information in the community in general, which, maybe again, that makes sense. But I think in, many circumstances, there's master's programs and things related to regulatory affairs, or there's, various certifications, and that might be a space where an educational module in terms of, technical simulation or application, that might be a little bit niche, but that might be something that could be valuable for folks to put together, whoever that group might be. I think at this point, we'll see if there's any questions from the audience. We did get a few, but I want to see if anybody has anything to bring into the chat. I've got one to start off here. Let me scroll to it. Let me see here. Yeah, so this gets back to the question. We were talking earlier about clinical endpoints and technical endpoints. And this question kind of gets at the association between modeling outputs and clinical endpoints, and to what extent it makes sense to. And actually, before I do that, Alex, if you're still on, do you want to join us for the Q&A? All
Yep.
right. Okay. I will, thank you for joining. All right, I'm going to ask this question to Jeff. As we think about technical endpoints and clinical endpoints in real world data, can you think about like sort of how might we go and approach the question as written is, to what extent can we establish an association between technical endpoints and clinical endpoints based on real world data? To what extent does the dichotomy between this data and the association between them challenge assumptions that clinical endpoints are the gold standard? So I think, in other words, have we relied on clinical endpoints thus far simply because they are easy to measure or the only measurable quantities? And could it be that we can find endpoints that are more relevant from a public health perspective that differ from classical clinical endpoints through the use of modeling and simulation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a radical idea, right? It would definitely challenge the status quo. I don't know if I can comment on how successful that might be. I think we would need to find an example where the case is very strong, and push and see what happens. I don't know if any examples come to my mind immediately.
Yeah.
But there are a couple cases where we have that linkage between the engineering world and clinical world, or at least the basis for one. So for problems that are around fatigue and durability, the relationship between, say, stress or strain that you would get out of a simulation and the life of the implant is essentially the traditional SN curve from engineering, which is the relationship between stress and strain and the number of cycles to failure. So that in some sense you could view that SN curve as that missing link between the engineering simulation output and the clinical interest, which is the life of the device. But unfortunately, there aren't a lot of other examples of that. So now the question is, is there a way to redesign clinical trials around the engineering endpoints? It's an interesting idea, and I don't know if I have an opinion yet. I'd love to see a proposal, a more concrete proposal with an example that we could challenge and propose and push on a little bit.
Absolutely. It's almost this concept of biomarkers, and do you have a computational biomarker that you could link to, something that you could measure? And I know at least in the biotech space, the idea of biomarkers that aren't exactly clinical endpoints is a hotly discussed topic. So we'll say that. Alex, do you have any thoughts on this one in particular, with respect to clinical endpoints? And, they're the current gold standard, but, are we missing something by just including those as our endpoints for trials? And, what might we be able to do by leveraging modeling simulation?
Yeah, maybe two thoughts. One is that sometimes the use of clinical endpoints is because they're directly related to the things that from a public health point of view matter, but actually they don't necessarily relate to anything that you can change in a design or in an obvious way, right? Per contra, you have the other extreme where you have technical endpoints that are directly related to things you need to change and you can improve, but maybe they have an indirect link with the clinical values. And so I think there's like two extremes of explainability, if you want, that have perhaps different purposes. And I think would be really interesting to reconcile those. And I think that's an area where perhaps AI is going to be really important, because in many cases we don't really understand the mechanism behind, but what we're interested is in developing mappings that go from one space, the technical space, to the clinical space. And I think there are possibly areas where, just to give an example, one area that is relevant as well for Medtronic is you have say a cardiac valve, and it may be that there is something to do with the hemodynamic patterns that is actually related to how you have the position of plaques into those valves. And I've seen some papers trying to argue that way. So how you actually modify the flow, what sort of device does it, perhaps is less important as to the way you have modified the hemodynamics and the impact this will have in plaque formation or in reverting that. Or the same with remodeling, for instance, of the heart. So maybe by understanding the link between what we could call the technical endpoints and also more physiological endpoints, which is something in between the clinical and the technical, might be a way to come to modulators. I think what ultimately this will force us is to have a better understanding about what are we doing, because at the moment it's a bit black boxy with regular testing procedures and regular trials.
Mm-hmm.
And that also connects a bit with the other discussion that you were having earlier about to what extent one is prepared to take extra effort and extra risk in acquiring new data, because sometimes that is the cost of explainability. That's the cost of finding causal relationships between things, and you can only save that at the expense of having less clarity on those. So it's a bit of, again, another trade-off.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I know for some of the things that we've done, just sort of thinking about it on the example of valve outputs and cardio outputs, the clinical endpoints of, for instance, all-cause mortality, that's a very, very general term. And, hopefully an intervention is going to, help with that concept. But, it's something that I've struggled with in terms of thinking about this mapping, and how, to your point, Alex, of, how can we incorporate more physiological markers, biomarkers that might be a link between, the acute sort of localized effect of a device and the clinical physiological longitudinal type outputs of a clinical results. I think it's very interesting. Philippe, any thoughts on this one?
I think there's a lot of effort to improve the clinical trials, and one aspect is the prompts. So patient-reported outcomes, which are extremely subjective, depend on what day you ask the patient how it's feeling and those kind of things. So I know the community is trying to improve those. One example that I think is interesting is, again, loosening of implants. So when the implant doesn't hold in the bone anymore, there's something that typically surgeons would assess in an X-ray and would look at little bands on the image, and it takes years to see. So typically in a clinical trial, we would require 10 years till we see those things. And the Nordic countries now actually accept 2 years only when you put little beads in the bone that allow you to exactly track how much the implant is moving over time. And so that actually is a very engineer measurable output that is now replacing that something that was very subjective and vague. And I think that's really interesting, because it shortens the time that we need to follow the patients, and something that we can also simulate very easily. So I think that's an example that gives hope.
Yeah, definitely. We got a question that just came in. Right. So this is for Edan. He said, in your opinion, what is the best practice to validate a model that maps a technical endpoint to a clinical physiological endpoint? So on this topic, it seems that the VVUQ process can be a bit different for this mapping from what's discussed in ASME VNV40. So Jeff, I'll go to you on this. Again, this topic of mapping technical endpoint to clinical physiological endpoint, and particularly related to perhaps the UQ process.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and the person posing the question is correct that the VNV40 standard very much presumes that we're validating a simulation against some, well-designed experiment, and that's sort of the underlying assumption of it. And so the idea of validating either statistical inputs or virtual patients or the link between a model and the clinical outputs, these, we can call them models, but they're not really contemplated by the standards as being, discretized finite element models, right? So they're a different sort of thing. And so there really isn't any standardized way that's been developed or published in the standards or in the FDA guidance to really speak to these issues. There was the one paper that I co-authored with some folks from FDA and a few other academic researchers where we explored this idea a little bit of breaking a complicated overall simulation down into components and trying to deal with each of these components one at a time from a validation perspective. But there is still a lot of sort of missing methods and ideas yet to be developed before that becomes a very mature, repeatable kind of technique.
Yeah, I like that. Philippe, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I agree. It's something that is slowly evolving. More and more people are looking into this. In our group also, we are, we did the In-Silico clinical trial. How do you validate this against clinical data? Against no guidance, very little published work on this. So we created our own method, published it to get the feedback from the reviewers and have the academic stamp on our approach. But I think that's a field that is still evolving, and we need more standardization there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And consistent with what we've said before, we'll make sure we include the link to the paper that Jeff was referring to there that he co-wrote on the topic of in silico clinical trials and verification through your hierarchical approaches and so forth. Alex, I think you had a really interesting question with respect to validation, specifically around protocols and clinical data. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me is the concept of there being an ethical dilemma between the incorporation of models and reducing trial size and really trying to get all these things pulled together. Can you ask that question? I think you probably have a better handle on it than my read of it, but curious to hear the answers here.
Yeah, so this was inspired a bit by Jeff's insight into how study protocols may need some reconsideration, right, compared to what we do now, and extend the sort of data that is collected. And many of us, in collaborations with clinicians, when we try to collect, the data that was ideal for modeling, we realize that this would require extra effort from them and sometimes extra study, from patients. So the question is how much of that would, is ethical to do. But on the counter side, we are prepared to do a less thorough data collection that just, continues with the current way of working of conventional trials, even if that implies doing a less invasive, it's not about invasive, it's about extensiveness. Sometimes it may not be an invasive study, but you're asking extra measurements, right? And so say that we're not increasing necessarily invasiveness to make things simple, but you need more extensive examination, longer examination, for instance. To what extent is more or less ethical to be prepared to have a less extensive protocol over a much larger population, perhaps for a suboptimal answer, as opposed to having a more extensive protocol on a lower number of patients that provides you a higher insight, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that between this, which is clearly an extreme of situations, to make my point, but there may be a lot of different gray zones, right? And what are your thoughts and from your experience as well about this, and also how we convey the fact that data with models can go much further than data alone?
Either one of you want to tackle that first?
I guess I'll give it a try. It's a really interesting insight that Alex just articulated. I hadn't thought of it exactly that way, but I love the way he posed that. I would say that right now, I would say that when we get into the clinical phase of product development, I think companies tend to be very conservative, right? Do what's known, do what we know works, because we're very close to market. We don't want any surprises at that moment, right? The risk tolerance of an organization goes down, I think, pretty dramatically as we reach that phase, right? Because people are counting on the launch of the product for revenue. They're already starting to think about ramping up production, right? So there's a lot of things happening, and they want predictability. And so this kind of works against us a little bit as we try to innovate in this area with modeling, right? So that there's just a conservative perspective that the organization has about trying new things that could upset the launch of a product that they're planning for. So I think it would be really interesting to pose it exactly the way Alex did to somebody with a bioethics background, even as a proposal for a study, to think about, like, is there some way of trying to balance these ideas? And I don't know if it's done mathematically. I'm not exactly sure how a bioethicist would approach this, whether it's just subjectively or mathematically. How do you balance this need to reduce patient risk on one hand, but to get as much information as possible to alleviate perhaps the risk of future patients by developing a model? I think that's a really novel idea that I'm not sure I can speak to, but I think would be a really cool thing for others to work on.
Agree with that. Philippe, any thoughts?
I agree with everything that has been said. It's a big frustration. We would like to, with models, make better products, serve the patient, and sometimes we don't have the data that we need. And if maybe, it often comes back to patient willingness to share the data. So if we could find enough people who are ready to do the extra burden of providing more data, providing more information, maybe that would work. Again, I'm not an ethics person either, so I don't know if that
No, it's a great thought. What always comes to my mind in this concept is just the idea of implantable sensors. And I know there's obviously, Philippe, you're aware of this, but there's a knee implant that you guys produce that has a sensor in it that reports a lot of data, and the collection of that data. It's something that's very useful for the clinicians, to at least advertise this being something that helps in recovery. But that data, the collection of that data, maybe the repurposing of that for purposes of improving models and kind of going in that direction. But Alex, that's a great thought in terms of the ethical considerations around robustness of data collection versus scope of a trial in terms of size is a very important one.
The other aspect, perhaps, Steve, is that while we can answer that ethical dilemma, and we have sort of what we may need to do as engineers or as scientists is looking at, can we somehow do inference from real-world data? So this is data already collected for other purposes, perhaps not in the sort of exact same group that we are targeting with our innovation, but can we use those other data to do inference about those parameters we cannot measure in the target population, and in a sense, have that as a second best, right? As a second best option. And if that would help to make the case of why modeling can bring additional insights, it maybe there is an incentive to actually do and more ethical justification for actually collecting that extra information, if that was going to reduce even further the uncertainty that we have, right?
Right. So if the inference can demonstrate the value, the potential value of gathering this additional data, then that clarifies the ethical question, because it helps to demonstrate that indeed there's going to be a benefit.
In fact, almost probably reverse the ethical consideration. Is there is a risk or is an ethical not to measure that, if that would help you to do it better. And I'm wondering to some extent whether that's something that as yet, option C, going lower in perhaps in quality, but but increasing in easiness of arrive is, can we look at other ways of doing inference through perhaps reconsidering the use of animal experiments, not so much as the experiment, because we know it has all kind of limitations, but as the way to validate or invalidate models in context that we fully control, so that then we can again sort of gain further trust on the use of those models in situations where neither human or animal experiments would be advised or ethical.
Right. Yeah, it's a question of what's the least amount of ethical burden, if that's a thing that can be that is needed to justify the use of a model if the model is going to produce the evidence. Yeah, I like that a lot. Interesting. Any other questions from the field? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up here. All right. Philippe, Jeff, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate the insights. Alex, thanks for organizing this and your general leadership on the CEiRSI. Excellent things to come from that. I think Laura put in some notes with respect to connecting with various communities, LinkedIn Hub, Eventbrite page, etc. Make sure you connect there. We will, as mentioned throughout, be including specific notes on this video on the YouTube channel. So we'll make sure that that's in there, and plenty of resources. But appreciate everybody's interest in joining us, and we'll connect later.